Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for being here. I must, at the beginning, say a deep thank you to Coearth Foundation, to Abid for inviting me here. And I have to say, I feel very humbled to be here, and I mean this very genuinely after hearing the presentations that have taken place so far today. What remarkable and inspiring work is taking place that one has so little conception of. I have no background at all in architecture, but of course, when you're working in a school, you are implicitly concerned with spaces and their use, even if you don't think about it explicitly. Initially, I had thought I should try and tailor this presentation towards architecture, to base it on some of the spaces in schools that I'm familiar with. But after a conversation with Abid, I realized that might not be necessary. The professionals have done that already. And instead, I'll try and give you an overview of J. Krishnamurti's vision of education and some of the things that happen in a Krishnamurti school. And broadly, there'll be two parts to this presentation. The first part will be based on a series of images, and I'll say something about each of the images. And the second part will be based on a series of quotations from Krishnamurti. You must be wondering about this title, Two Horses, Krishnamurti and an Educational Space. So let me try and plunge into it straight away. And this is, in fact, a metaphor that Krishnamurti uses. I should say implicitly, I'm really exploring the same question that Manas began with. What is a school for? What is learning about? Why do we need schools at all? So what is right education? Is it not both the cultivation of a brain that can function excellently in the world and also psychologically understand the whole meaning of existence, the self, the I, the psyche? Couldn't these two go together like two well-trained horses trotting along harmoniously together? You understand my question? And apparently one horse is highly developed, the other is still a baby, a foal. Now this is an arresting metaphor, this metaphor of two horses. The one concerned with what here Krishnamurti refers to as functioning excellently in the world, which is the one I think he says is highly developed, and the other to do with understanding existence and understanding the self. The horse that is in fact underdeveloped, that is stunted. Now this is an interesting dichotomy, but in my view, a slightly misleading one. And I'll come back to that later. But for now, let's just hold this as a kind of way of looking at two aspects of education. One concerned, let's say, with the functional, and the other concerned with, let's call it the spiritual, for want of a better word. So, Krishnamurti had a long and very interesting life. I mean, I could take this whole session just talking to you about his life, so I won't do that. I will just raise one question, which is, how do you, if you're familiar at all with Krishnamurti, how would you classify him? Was he an educator? Was he a philosopher? Was he a thinker? Was he a spiritual guru? He was a little bit of all of these. And yet, it would be somewhat misleading to to sort of classify him as any one of them, or even any combination of them. And there's a kind of delicious appropriateness in the fact that it's hard to classify Krishnamurti, because a part of his discourse was, in fact, to critique this very strong human tendency to label, to classify, to box things. And it was so inspiring to hear more than one of the speakers before me speak about, in an educational space, the in-between spaces, the liminal spaces, the spaces of transition. And I think that is in keeping with the spirit of Krishnamurti's life and person, and the way he thought of education as well. Now, these pictures show the Krishnamurti that I remember. I was a student at Rishi Valley School from 1979 to 1985. And these pictures are from the early 1980s, when Krishnamurti was in the last decade of his life. He was in his late 80s. And you see the color pictures on the right. These are Krishnamurti would spend something like 6 weeks a year in winter at Rishi Valley, during which he'd have a number of conversations with students. And when I use the word conversations, I choose the word deliberately, because they were not anything like talks of a usual kind. He would sometimes open up with a certain subject, but more often ask students to raise questions they had. And I remember, especially in the early years, feeling utterly bewildered, because it looked as if Krishnamurti never gave any answers. He was constantly pushing back on your questions, pushing you to think with him. And characteristically, as you can see in this picture, if a student was brave enough to raise a question, he would often ask the child to come and sit with him. So some children asked questions only because they wanted to go and sit there. And it was exciting to be there with the video cameras on you and so on. Others avoided asking questions for exactly the same reason. They were afraid of being there. And there would be a lot of playful but serious exchanges that took place between students and Krishnamurti. And there was no subject which was out of bounds. You could take up anything and he would push the questioning very deeply. So there are currently 6 Krishnamurti schools in India. The oldest is Rishi Valley. There's Rajghat Besant School in Banaras, which is almost the same age. Then the school KFI. KFI is the Krishnamurti Foundation of India, and the Valley School in Bangalore, where I currently am, which both started in the 1970s. Sahyadri School near Pune, and Pathshala, which is also in Tamil Nadu. The last 2 schools were founded after Krishnaji's death in 1986. There also used to be a small school in the Himalayas near Uttarkashi. It was a village school. It was for children from the neighboring villages. I worked there for 5 years. And I think a lot of my learning and growth as a teacher and as a human being happened because of those 5 years there. For various reasons, the school closed down. There are also 2 Krishnamurti schools abroad. There's one in the UK at a place called Brockwood Park, and there's a school in a small town called Ojai near LA in California. But these schools are administered by parallel foundations. So the Krishnamurti Foundation of India is one foundation. There's an American foundation, there's a British foundation, and there's a Latin American foundation. After Krishnamurti's death, uh, there was no successor. There was no Krishnamurti figure. There's only a foundation, which includes trustees. And the foundation's work is largely an administrative kind of work, looking after the schools, their finances, their properties, publications work, and so on and so forth. So as I said, I'm going to show you a series of images, and these images are all of Rishi Valley School. And I've chosen Rishi Valley since I have memories from as a child as well as a teacher there. And I'd like to use these images to introduce you to some aspects of what a Krishnamurti school looks like. So as you can see in this picture, you have hills, rather barren and stark. Geologically, these hills are among the oldest in the subcontinent. Several, I think something like 100 times older than the Himalayas. These are residual hills in the Deccan Plateau. So stark rock formations. It's a drought-prone area. It's in the rain shadow of the Western Ghats. So the presence of drought is always a concern. And yet you'll see, especially in the foreground, a lot of greenery. And that's because ever since the school was founded in the early 30s, there's been a very active afforestation program, which I'll speak a little bit more about a little later. You have the playground, and in the distance, at the foot of the hill, you can see a village. So we are surrounded by small villages and hamlets. People do subsistence agriculture. They have cattle. Of course, today their occupations have diversified because settlements have come closer. There are various educational institutions. People from the villages take jobs in those places. But it's essentially a very rural area. And the majority of the children who come to the school are urban. And so, as I was when I went there, and so for the children who go to Rishi Valley, the years they spend there, it's fair to say that that would be their closest brush with some of the realities of rural India. Because most of them would go back to cities for university, very likely take up mainstream, or if not mainstream, other careers that would keep them primarily in the cities, and so on. What you see in this picture is a group of students and teachers participating in a harvest. And the harvest is actually of sugarcane, which might seem odd to you since I said that it's a drought-prone area and we all know that sugarcane takes a lot of water. But for several years, Rishi Valley was experimenting with sugarcane growing techniques which involved drip irrigation, very little water consumption, and quite successfully. And whenever it was sugarcane harvest time, the whole community got involved in helping harvest, as you can see here. And it was one of the possibilities that was opened up for students by virtue of being a school in an area which is primarily agrarian and agricultural. In my time, this photo is from when I was a teacher. When I was a student, I don't remember that we did a lot of farming activity. There was less farming activity at that time because there was less water. But students were very closely involved in the afforestation program. And afforestation on those hills is not easy. The ground is hard. Digging pits to plant saplings is not easy. And then looking after them is also not easy because you have to transport the water. And so I remember days when school would be closed, school would be shut for half the day, and in various parts of the hillside, we'd gather, we'd form long lines that snaked their way up the hill, and we'd actually carry water in buckets from hand to hand up the hill in order to water the plants. Now, in itself, it's a small activity, but I'm mentioning it because an experience of that kind stays with you. You realize, even if you don't think of it explicitly at the time, how precarious existence can be in an area which is water-starved. The difficulty of having anything grow and survive. So one feature of the school then has always been, in one way or the other, to keep in touch with the earth. And I think that comes quite directly out of Krishnamurti's vision of education, to which I'll come a little later. I should also say, before I move to the next slide, that this kind of work also lent itself for the senior students to projects in what we call the General Studies program, where typically they would study their surroundings, taking up some practical problem and going into the field and trying to understand what the problem was, what some solutions might be, and so on. So just to give you one example, we have a health center that's based at Rishi Valley, and it caters to the local population. And the Rural Health Center, as part of its study of the local population, found, to its surprise, that there was a high degree of diabetes in the local population, which was counterintuitive because, of course, food habits are simple there and based on coarse grains and so on. So students, along with the health center, actually studied this to try and understand what was going on. And eventually they came up with this explanation. The Andhra government, in order to encourage agriculture in poor areas, had started a scheme of providing free agricultural power for something like 7 or 8 hours a day. As a result, farmers had dug bore wells and were pumping water out of the earth in great quantities because they didn't have to pay for it. With that water, they shifted from traditional dryland crops, millets, ragi, groundnuts, to things like paddy, which had never been grown in this area, but which, of course, gave them higher returns if they could produce a successful crop. Once they started growing paddy, of course, diets changed as well. And from there, it was a short step to a new breed of diseases which hadn't been known in this area traditionally. So I'm just mentioning this as an example of how this kind of contact with the surroundings also lent itself to some fairly substantive research that senior students were able to do, as well as a lot of hands-on, get your hands dirty kinds of work. Another activity that's very central to the school is art and craft. And you see a group of students sitting out here, all sitting around a potted plant. So it's likely that these are art students, because one of their exam papers was nature studies. But it wasn't only the art students who did art. So in Rishi Valley, which begins in class 4 and goes up to class 12, there are 2 art blocks a week for every student, from class 4 to class 12. And a block is an hour and a half. So about 3 hours of artwork a week, typically for any student, and for the art students, those who take it for the exam, even more. So art And it's not just painting, it's carpentry, clay, batik, and so on and so forth. Very central to the school. Uh, and it does many things. First of all, it's never organized around competition. In fact, I should say that one thing which is very central to the way school functions is that activities are not organized competitively. But we do have an art exhibition at the end of the year, where the work of children through the year is put together for display for a few days. One thing which I think this focus on art does is, especially like in this picture when children are sitting outside and observing something and painting, it certainly sharpens their ability to sit quietly with a task, sharpens their quality of attention. Now, this is a word I'm going to keep coming back to, attention, so central to the way things happen in the school. And I think that becomes a kind of, let's say, muscle building of a certain kind for life. The muscle being that of attention, in a world especially where distraction is so common and so easy. So I think this sort of thing, being able to sit quietly over time with something, is a kind of antidote to the distractions that we are susceptible to. But what about sports? I just said that we don't have a lot of competition, or we downplay competition. So does sports have any place at all in the school? Thank you so much. Yeah. Sorry. Up. Yeah. Okay. In fact, the school has a lot of sports. And I remember from the time I was a student, we had sports at least twice a day, because the morning would begin with half an hour of outdoor time where we'd jog or have yoga or do other kinds of physical exercises, and about an hour in the evening where we played games. And then because it was a boarding school, weekend was a time when everybody was out playing something or the other. Now, how do you have sports without competition? You don't. Of course, you're playing, you're scoring goals, you are scoring more runs, whatever it is, or you're running races. We have a sports day, which was quite competitive, I should admit. So I think the way it works is not that you ban something like competition, but use things that are happening in the school as a way of observing competition, not just competition as it exists in the school, but what it does to you inwardly. The kind of highs it gives you when you do well, the lows that it puts you through when you don't do so well, when somebody beats you, and so on. In other words, competition, like anything else, is something that can be learnt from. It's not a demon that has to be pushed aside. Anything becomes a learning opportunity. So there's competition, and there are conversations, lots of conversations. When I think back on my time in Rishi Valley as a student, I think half the time I was in discussions with people about various things. And I find this now, especially as an adult, looking back on it, I can see the value of this. This habit of being able to look at your daily experiences. And it's not as if in a school you are shielded from daily experiences. You go through it all. You go through competition. You go through fear. You go through envy. You go through jealousy. You go through loneliness. It's all there. No school can protect you from those feelings. However, there's an opportunity to actually try and understand these things, to watch them operate, to pay attention to these things, and to start learning about them. I'm also grateful to Rishi Valley because I think it's because of my time there that I have a lifelong habit of wanting to be out and exercising in the morning. And I can see how much that has benefited me. And it's not an easy thing to sell students who would rather not get up at 5:30 in the morning and be out on the field running or playing or anything. But many of them also make this a habit, and then it's really nice for them. Another way of engaging with the outdoors, in the valley we are surrounded by hills. There isn't a weekend where there isn't a group going up on a hike to one of the hills. These are seniors who've gone a bit further on one of the longer hikes. And it's again a beautiful way of connecting with the earth, connecting with nature, experiencing difficulties because hikes can be challenging, learning to look out for each other, and so on. In fact, it's a bit of a coincidence. I was just talking about competition, but you know, on the left of this picture, there's a girl in black who's sitting. Well, this photo is from 20 years ago, and I just met her last week. And she's doing such interesting work in the area of sports these days. That's her work now. She set up an organization along with her husband, who is the guy in black sitting in front of her, by the way, where they use ultimate frisbee, which is a very interesting sport, both competitive as well as introspective, as a way of helping communities to develop. And these are marginalized communities, Adivasi communities, fishing communities in Tamil Nadu, and so on, as a way of helping them build confidence in their own abilities, helping them be more articulate, helping them to look at their own lives, and so on. So it's a lovely example of how sport can be used as a tool for many things. Dance. The very slight oddness in this photo might be that you see only males. Is it that only boys learnt Bharatanatyam in Rishi Valley? Far from it. But I chose this photo just as a visual reminder of the fact that the usual sort of hierarchies of what is cool to do and what is not cool to do didn't always count for very much in Rishi Valley. So there were boys who took dance rather than going in for sports. Speaking for myself, I decided to learn music, and I learned Carnatic music, which again came at the cost of some amount of sports and so on. So there's a very strong tradition of classical dance, of classical music, but other kinds of dance as well. So for example, there was folk dance where from the 1950s, I think, some visitors to Rishi Valley had introduced children to folk dances from around the world, from the Middle East, from Europe, from America. And this is a cherished tradition which is carried, down the generations of students. On Sundays, the kids get together and do dancing together. And here you have another kind of music. This is on a Sunday, as I gauge from the way the children are dressed, because children are allowed these kinds of t-shirts at Rishi Valley only on a Sunday. And they are jamming. They're just playing the guitar. Again, music in Rishi Valley is never competitive. People come together, play together. We have musical evenings where they get the opportunity to perform. So the emphasis is really on doing music, on learning, on building your skills, rather than on being better than anybody else. Um, this picture is of a morning assembly. Every day begins with an assembly. 3 days a week, the whole school gets together and sings or chants in the large school auditorium, which is the same building where Krishnamurti used to speak. A beautiful structure without walls. This is on one of the other days because it's a separate assembly. This is taking place in the junior school. And as you can see, the girl there is speaking about something. So the assembly became a space where children got to research something, get over their inhibitions about speaking in public, perform something, and assembly would always end with a few minutes of silence, which is again something I'll come back to. In all this, did we study? Yes. There were studies also in the school, and this, as you can see, is a fairly standard laboratory kind of photographs. You'll notice that the class is small. Rishi Valley, from class 4 to class 12, had only around 360 students. And there was a lot of flexibility in the 11th and 12th when they had to choose their subjects. As long as students were clear about what their college options were, and as long as it was able to fit it into the timetable, students could really take whatever combination of subjects they wanted. So it isn't as if we had a rigid science stream and a commerce stream and a humanities stream and so on. Wasn't unusual for somebody to be doing, say, something like maybe biology, chemistry, English literature, and fine art, for example. So those kinds of slightly offbeat combinations of subjects are fairly common because we encourage students to do what they really wanted to do. Computer lab, now this must look prehistoric, but this is from about, again, from maybe around 15 years ago. So we have a computer lab and students use it for work, and students use it once a week to communicate with home by email. So technologically, Rishi Valley will look a bit old-fashioned. Students are not permitted to have their own devices of any kind. They do have access to the internet and to computers when they need it for work and when they need to get in touch with their parents and so on. Of course, things are changing very rapidly. We don't know what AI is going to do with education over the next few years and how that's going to impact the way we use computers. But in general, there's been a preference to go slow on technology. And the reason for this is not that anybody is against technology. It's a question of prioritizing, and to us it seems that what's really at the heart of the school is human connections. Connections that students have with each other, connections that students have with teachers, conversations, all of which can be messy, can be inefficient, but ultimately that's life far more than sitting in front of a screen and getting your answers pat. So this is a typical classroom in junior school. It happens to be my first classroom when I was in class 7. Though this photo is from when I was a teacher. As you can see, it's a very simple classroom. Furniture's basic, shelves. The seating is a bit mixed. Some kids are sitting facing the teacher, others are facing each other. And so this kind of flexibility in the way children were spaced in the class, changing the arrangement of a class from class to class, that would all happen. Classes were also often outdoors. Weather is often, conducive to sitting outside under a tree. This is again in the junior school. And one question which arises is, weren't students distracted? You sit there and there are people passing and somebody waves, somebody says something. And yes, of course, when you're outside, you're connected with much more. There are so-called distractions. But then, is distraction necessarily a bad thing? Is a question which needs to be asked. And is a mind that's attentive necessarily incapable of being focused, even if at times there's something else happening? I think we assume that children need to be in sort of hermetically protected spaces in order to learn without distraction. That assumption needs to be questioned. In fact, Krishnamurti frequently makes a distinction between attention and what he calls concentration. And to put it crudely, I think he sees concentration as a kind of narrowing in, where you try to exclude a great deal in order that you just focus on one thing or the other. And he sees that as counterproductive for learning. And I think he sees learning coming out of a state of attention when the mind is really open to everything. It's listening to somebody speak, but it's also aware of other sounds, other things happening, and so on. So distraction as an idea needs to be questioned. I love this photo. To me, this is the heart of the school. And it exemplifies the kind of interstitial space that some of the presenters earlier today spoke about. You're not in a classroom, you're not even in a class, but something is happening. There's a teacher and a group of students walking. Looks as if classes are over and they're walking for lunch. When I was confronted with having to take a decision about what I wanted to do after university, and I thought that teaching was something I'd like to do, I think what made it very clear for me that teaching in a school, and maybe especially a school like a Krishnamurti school, was what I really wanted to do, was memories of this sort of thing. Interactions of various kinds with teachers. Talking about fun stuff, talking about serious things, but just having that space to connect with people in which your roles as teacher, student, and so on seem to dissolve. Another picture of a similar kind of thing. Here it's outside the senior school, a teacher and a senior student together talking about something, maybe some assignment or some idea the student has, just taking time over it. Just a few more photos. This photo is of the Rural Education Center, the main rural education center at Rishi Valley. Now, this is a parallel educational program that was started initially in the 1960s, but really sort of took off in the 1980s and 1990s, initially for children in villages nearby, which were poorly resourced, poorly funded, there were no teachers. And so an entire methodology of self-learning, what was called the multi-grade, multi-level, MGML system, was evolved to cater to children where you'd have, say, 30 children of different ages learning together with just one teacher. Now, I'm not going to say more about the rural education program, though it's now become a vast thing. And I'll just talk a little bit about the connection between the main school and the rural education. This has been over the years, there are different ways in which children in the main school have had opportunities to interact with the children in the rural school from the villages. Through some activity, through some craft, through mutual language learning, one thing which was very clear was that it was important for the children in the main school not to go and meet the rural children as providers in some sense. It was important that it be a space where they're learning together. And very often the learning, in fact, was in the reverse direction. So it was the village children who would be teaching our kids songs or puppetry. There's this very strong puppetry, local puppetry tradition. And I think this again, like the work on the land, was a rather special opportunity which many of our kids got to experience and value. Another point of contact was Sankranti, which is Pongal, major festival in that area in January. And in the villages, of course, Pongal is very much an agricultural festival. The villagers would, decorate their animals, especially the bulls, and there would be dances and music. They would bring the animals to the school campus. Children would join them. We had a wonderful dairy, which unfortunately had to close down because of the drought. And there'd be Pongal festivals there also, and so on. Now, Krishnamurti could be, in fact, was a rather stern critic of organized religion in any form and belief systems generally. But I think he valued the kind of joyous celebrations that are part of any religious tradition. It might be Pongal, Christmas Eve, we had a long-running tradition of caroling. Eid, the dining hall would make something special. We'd have students speaking about the festival. So religion as celebration, religion as something which brings people together was very much part of the school experience for the lives of children. But not religion as sort of practice, as faith, and so on. Though we did chanting, we did Sanskrit chanting, for example, right? But much more as a kind of aesthetic experience than, let's say, a spiritual one. And this is the last photo I'll show, and this photo, as you can see, is from long ago. It's from when I was a student. And Astachal was a time in the evening when the whole school would gather together on a hillside after sunset and look at the western sky for about 15 or maybe 20 minutes. And it was a time only of quiet. There was no practice, there was no keep your eyes closed, there was no chanting. It was just a time to sit quietly together. And there's something magical about people coming together only to be quiet with no other agenda. Excuse me. I often think that just as many people together in a room can make more noise than one person, I think many people together in a room can create a deeper silence than one person alone. And this is something I've actually experienced. And the question is, why is it there? What's the importance of silence? Now, this is again a subject that one could go into, but there are various silences of this kind that are built into the school day. I mentioned after assembly, but this is the most significant one. So, as I said, I'm going to read you a few quotations from Krishnamurti. I won't say too much about them. I think there's not much to say. If the educator and the student lose their relationship to nature, they will certainly lose their relationship with humanity. So Krishnamurti makes this very sort of inextricable connection between nature and humanity. You can't have one without the other. And which is why in all of the Krishnamurti schools, first of all, they're all located in places where, whether it's Rishi Valley, which has a couple of hundred acres, or the school in Chennai, which has 4 acres, they all are beautiful campuses. They all have trees, they have hills, they have, well, forests as in the Valley School. There's space for children to learn what it is to value the natural world, and space for them to observe it, to internalize it, to make it part of their lives in some sense. And that seems to me so important, because today when you have arguments about major developmental projects, very often you have the developmental argument pitted against the environmental argument. And it becomes an entirely cerebral kind of thing. Depending on which side seems to have a more convincing argument, you'll probably plump for that side if you're honest. But when nature is experienced as something that's part of you, it's no longer a matter of argument. The destruction of a forest in some ways destroying you, not as an idea, but as something which you experience. And that, I think, changes the way you relate with the world and changes the way you relate with other human beings as well. Education is not just to pass exams, get a job and settle down, but also to be able to listen to the birds, see the sky, see the extraordinary beauty of a tree and the shape of the hills, and to feel with them, to be really directly in touch with them. And then this marvelous question, can you look at a tree without naming it? Now, I have a personal relationship with this question, because I remember in one of Krishnaji's talks when I was a student, as I said, the assembly hall was open, there were no walls. And I remember this so vividly. He's pointing outside and said, just look at those. And can you just look at that tree without saying anything about it, without allowing any thought to come into it, without even identifying what tree it is? And I was maybe in class 8 or something, and I tried to do this very earnestly. I actually went and sat next to a tree and I tried looking at it without thinking anything about it. Needless to say, I failed, because the more you're trying not to think about something, you're thinking more and more about it. But just as a kind of koan-like possibility, it seems so fascinating to be able to relate to the world without categories, without labels, and so on. It is far more important to observe yourself than another, because what you are, the other is. This is such a wonderful corrective to what you see happening in the world today, where people are constantly sitting in judgment on somebody or the other, something or the other. You are the world and the world is you. The two are not separate. And this you are the world is very central to Krishnamurti's thought. He's not denying individual differences between people, but I think what he's recognizing is that at a fundamental level, let's call it a psychological level, people are really susceptible to the same things. We all operate in much the same way in the way we experience the feelings we have, the way we are susceptible to certain kinds of things, the way we are vulnerable, the things we think of as our strengths, the hold of ideologies on us, and so on. And once we recognize this, it makes division and conflict that much harder. What are you in conflict with if the other person is really no different from you? In attention, there's no point of focus. I spoke about this earlier. Attention is the way of looking at your own life without the center of self-interest. So this comes back to this whole business of looking at a tree. Is it possible to be attentive without the mind constantly saying things, without judgment, without categorization, without separations, and so on? The whole movement of life is learning. Every action and every relationship is learning. I spoke about this a little earlier in the context of competition. The problem is not competition. The issue is when there's competition or when there's conflict, is the human mind capable of learning from it? Learning, relationship is a mirror. This is another statement that's very central to Krishnamurti. It's in relationship that you start seeing yourself more clearly. You sit isolated in a cave and you can have all kinds of notions about yourself. Put one more person in that cave and things start getting revealed about yourself. School is a place of learning, not merely a place for accumulating knowledge. Krishnamurti doesn't deny the place of knowledge. But he says that learning is much more than accumulation. Almost all of us feel responsible for our families and children, but we do not have the feeling of being wholly concerned and committed to the environment around us, to nature, or of being totally responsible for our actions. That absolute care is love. Without it, society cannot change. Now, this is again very fundamental. And so, for example, an important trope, let us say, in any educational system around the world is some kind of nationalistic striving, some kind of patriotism, some kind of cultivating pride in your identity, your nation, and so on. But this is something Krishnamurti would very radically question. Because that sort of thing is divisive. What is it to be a human being in the world? To connect with the earth as a human being, not to connect with India as an Indian. Yeah, I've just been told it's time, so I'll just take another couple of minutes and then finish up. Fear, there's no place for fear in education. To be without fear is the beginning of wisdom. I won't go more into this. So we don't have prizes, we don't have punishments. So the question is, on what other basis can learning take place? And I think the key idea here is to discover a love for learning, for itself, for its own sake. If you have that, you need neither fear nor punishment nor reward in order to learn. This is again a crucial theme in Krishnamurti, which I first became interested in when one of my senior colleagues, soon after I became a teacher, was being interviewed by students. And the students asked him, what is it that you feel is really important to a Krishnamurti school? And he said, I'm very interested in the question of goodness. And I'd never thought of it. And goodness is very often a kind of practice to be achieved. Whereas Krishnamurti talks of it as a process of flowering, a state of being, and something which happens in the absence of the self. Now again, there's more that we could say about this, but I would not be flowering in goodness if I took more time. So here are a few quotes from one of Krishnamurti's books called Education and the Significance of Life. A sort of, I won't read it, you can read it for yourself. Covers many of the things which I spoke about. I think the last point, to bring about a fundamental change in ourselves, that's so crucial. So we come back to this quote about the two horses. And In this, as I said, Krishnamurti seems to make a distinction between functioning excellently in the world, which seems to be a more pragmatic business, and understanding the meaning of existence, which is a more spiritual business. But as I said, it's more subtle than that, because Krishnamurti, when he speaks of excellence, doesn't speak of excellence in terms of achievement. It again has to do with an excellence that's connected with goodness, a way of living with self-awareness, and so on. So what does it mean to live excellently? And in fact, are there two horses or is there only one? And this is almost my last slide. It is the responsibility of the teacher to create a new generation, to change the social structure from its preoccupation with earning a livelihood. Then teaching becomes a holy act. Now, it seems almost counterintuitive to hear Krishnamurti use a word like holy. But I think he meant this very deeply. I think he saw this as a very deep spiritual vocation, to be a teacher, to move yourself away from this preoccupation with livelihood and to help children to move away from it. So these are the two horses, or one. Just some resources. These are some books which are interesting to look at, as well as some other resources which may be of interest. So this presentation is here with the organizers. If anybody wants this list, they can get it from them. So thank you very much, and sorry for overshooting my time.